Hello, church. We are going to talk about marriage and the roles of husbands and wives today. Should be fun. To start with, let's have a little discussion. What do you think distinguishes a Christian marriage from a non-Christian one? Let's chat about that for a minute. So we're going through the book of 1 Peter, and we're in chapter 3 today, starting with verses 1 through 7. I'm going to read this passage, it's pretty short, in two different versions, just so we get a good flavor of what's going on. And starting with the New International Version, it says, "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that, if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters, if you do what is right, and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with the respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers." Okay, let's hear it again, but this time in the contemporary English version, and maybe this will resonate with you too. If you are a wife, you must put your husband first. Even if he opposes our message, you will win him over by what you do. No one else will have to say anything to him, because he'll see how you honor God and live a pure life. Don't depend on things like fancy hairdos or gold jewelry or expensive clothes to make you look beautiful. Be beautiful in your heart by being gentle and quiet. This kind of beauty will last, and God considers it very special. Long ago, those women who worshipped God and put their hope in Him made themselves beautiful by putting their husbands first. For example, Sarah obeyed Abraham, called him her master. You are her true children if you do right, and don't let anything frighten you. If you're a husband, you should be thoughtful of your wife. Treat her with honor, because she isn't as strong as you are, and she shares with you in the gift of life. Then nothing will stand in the way of your prayers. So, whenever we encounter a passage such as this one, sometimes it's difficult to consider the cultural setting of the original hearers, because we have our own biases and we are reading and seeing this through the lens of a dominance of men in history of the church and the patriarchal, hierarchical nature of our culture. And admittedly, well, this passage has been used to greatly abuse people, and abuses have taken place and led many, including myself, at first reading to bristle when I see this submit yourself, put your husband first, and this kind of moral subjugation of women by men. Many women have trouble hearing this text in any other way than how it was used by abusive men. So let's try and get our heads back into the setting in which the original hearers would have received this. So women in Asia Minor in Peter's day, although respected and protected in law, They were treated as inferior in every way to men. Many did not have rights of inheritance, no choice of relationships, limited ability to pursue a religious education or fully participate in the synagogue, and were restricted in the freedom of their movement. The Greco-Roman culture was changing in that day, and some women were engaged in private business, some served in public office, and had prominent roles in various religious cults, although these were invariably attained and through ritual temple prostitution. They were even able to vote under Roman law and eventually gained greater leverage in marriage and divorce choices and were encouraged in more education. In time, this wasn't terrible, considering that women in BC didn't get the vote until 1917 and across Canada another year later. However, sadly, Asian and Indigenous women had to wait until 1960 here in Canada to get the vote. Wow. Well, and the other thing unique to Peter's day and Peter's setting was that one of the primary ways in which Christian faith was spread during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, despite authorities trying to stamp it out. This was the way, because there were many more Christian women around than non-Christian ones. Girls were expensive and a difficult nuisance in a family. Christians and Jews refused to put a girl out at marriageable age to become a slave or a prostitute, and therefore there were just statistically more marriageable Christian women available. So taking the advice here, Christian families could grow and spread. And Peter's submission injunction here is at least a little bit pragmatic. He explains that it's because of the influence they can exert on their non-Christian husbands that they do nothing to bring the gospel into criticism. And this is really very consistent with what Tyler was teaching from chapter 2 last week, where we were told by Peter that Christians need to live holy lives so that nothing can be lodged against the gospel because of their behavior. And we're going to see this theme repeated again. He uses the phrase several times in these chapters, in the same way. Also, it was a big deal back then if a woman struck out on her own and joined a religion different from her husband's, and this in itself could be seen as insubordination. So Peter exhorts women to be circumspect, live a life of proclamation that can affirm or deny the authority of the gospel. Again, the adverbs of living with purity and reverence come into play, as Peter mentioned in chapter 2, 11 and 12, regarding how we live out our faith with respect to governing authorities. For wives, Peter then contrasts inner beauty and external beauty and commends a gentle and quiet spirit rather than cantankerous grumbling. Not that I know anything about that. Peter's appeal is not just pragmatic, though, because he legitimizes the instruction referring to women of the past who had Christian husbands. So it's not just about winning your husbands over to Christ, and then you live however you like, I guess. Well, in verse 7, he switches his attention to husbands, and the imperative is for husbands to be understanding or thoughtful or sensitive, as opposed to demanding or self-seeking. The reason given is that the wife is weaker And this is clearly referencing her physical capabilities in comparison to his. But twice he declares that wives and husbands are fellow heirs, and that these men and their wives will gain a hearing from God. Their prayers will be answered in an equal partner kind of view of marriage. So, upon reflection, what's changed? Let's have a table talk and talk about, is there anything different between men and women today than since Peter's day? Okay, so I'm not sure how your discussions went, but, as I reflect on this, here we are 2 millennia later, and I don't think things have changed that much. The curse set up relationships based on power and control, rather than on equality as God originally intended. God and mankind, remember in Genesis, they enjoyed this close relationship, but after the disobedience of Adam and Eve, shame and desire to hide from one another and from God entered the picture. The blame game also started. Man blaming God, and man blaming the woman, and the woman blaming the snake, and along with the curse, mankind was told that they will continue to want to control and lord over one another. The whole Me Too movement that happened not that many years ago brought some of this issue back to the forefront. Around 30% of North American women and 10% of men will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Of every 100 incidents of sexual assault in Canada, only 6 are reported to the police. 1 to 2% of date rapes are reported. 60% of sexual assault victims are under age 17. Over 80% of sex crimes are women. 80% of those are in the home, and 80% of the assailants are friends or family of the victim. So, getting hung up on this submission word is also part of the curse. Husbands demand submission when they're unable to get their way. Men have a tendency to be demanding and want to lord over. A good question for a man would be, why do I resort to demanding or force to get this done? So rather than demanding his rights, a man's responsibility is to be worthy of her respect. Women are not off the hook. We attempt to control with manipulation. I remember in the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the mother saying, "The man may be the head, but the woman is the neck." In other words, controls the head. Yeah. And women also try to control with their physical appearance or with their words. We're pretty good at that. Proverbs 14:1 says that the wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears hers down. I remember being convicted about this when I used to tease my husband by saying, "Oh, you don't understand, you're just a man." And partly I was trying to be funny, and maybe there was partly frustration with not feeling understood. But I know I had to stop putting down the male gender, as I was raising 2 sons as well, and I don't want to be a woman who tears down my own house. It was time for me to take some responsibility for communicating more effectively and more respectfully. The idea of building up our own house as opposed to tearing it down ourselves does not just apply to women, though. Peter admonished men to be thoughtful, to be considerate or understanding of their wives. A woman who knows her husband's understanding and sensitivity has no trouble respecting him and building him up. The challenge is, how does a man understand a woman? I guess that we all have something to work on, don't we? We need to let go. All of us need to let go of trying to exercise power and control over one another, and instead base our lives on lifting up one another as co-equals and heirs together. As Peter states, we're heirs together of God's life and of his grace. And it's interesting, but I've come across in my training these two wheels, and I think they've been put out and are used widely in those who deal with women experiencing domestic abuse. But I think there's a lot to be learned here for all of us in these two wheels, which spell out rather succinctly the difference between relationships that are based on violence, power and control, and it may not be physical violence, but it can certainly be psychological and verbal, emotional violence, and opposed to a non-violent relationship based on respect and equality. And this really needs to shape and govern all of our relationships, that we can learn how to live our lives with a respect and a sense of equality for all people. Whether we're married or not, we have relationships. And we may either be attempting to control another, or we may be feeling controlled by another. I hope it's helpful to you, but I've made a little comparison chart to more clarify this better way that Peter's trying to spell out for us. And so those, if you're feeling controlled, the things that will keep you stuck, or the attitudes that will keep you stuck, are focusing on that bad other person, or feeling like I have no choices, or I'm afraid. And what will set you free, as Peter says, live your life like you're not afraid. Recognize we are co-equal heirs of God's grace and life. I'm not less than. I'm not better than. I do have options to either tear down or build up, and I choose instead to do what is life-giving. And because God loves me, I have no fear. John writes, there's no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. As I grow in my understanding of God's love for me, I'm courageous and fearless. And then I can define and protect what God has given me with healthy boundaries and clear communication. I like that boundaries phrase that says, don't get mad, get clear. We can take responsibility for having better and more respectful and effective communication. If I'm feeling a desire to seize control, these are the things that will keep you stuck in unhealthy relationships. Just focus on the other person's inferiority and my own superiority. I'm entitled or deserving, after all. I have my rights. I must be understood. And what Peter is saying here instead is, remember, we are co-equal heirs of God's grace and life. And we can use our strength to build up another person. And I have a responsibility to seek first and be considerate and compassionate. Peter's really on a roll in these chapters, and we will see this theme of loving respect and honoring in his descriptions of holy living in order to glorify God and not bring the gospel into disrepute. There's something here for everyone, whether we're married or not, as we learn to lift up and honor one another in life together as co-equals and co-heirs of God's life, his gift of life, God is glorified. God bless you. Let's have another little table talk as we wrap it up. What changes then do I need to make as I think about my relationships based on what I've learned today? God bless you.